Venice, winter 1949. A woman walks alone through the narrow and damp streets, carrying a dead-handed cat in her hand. His eyes, once painted black coal and framed by extravagant false eyelashes that even measured 5 centimeters long, now reflects only the deep void of those who lost everything. Estimated fortune in $50 million, a beauty that inspired an entire generation of artists, which made sense with each breath. The jewels that once covered his body as a second shining skin were sold one by one in the Parisian attachment houses, replaced by rags that still try to maintain some trace of aristocratic elegance. She, in front of a mirror stained in a blurred showcase, and for a moment that lasts an eternity, sees not the reflection of a 68-year-old woman in terminal decay, but the ghostly shadow of an entire era she created, inhabited, and destroyed with her own coated hands. The cat in his arms have not breathed for hours, but she packs him like the last beautiful thing that left in this cruel and indifferent world, whispering words in Italian that echo through the empty channels like laments of a dead time. The seagulls shout over the big channel, and she lifts her eyes to the gray winter sky, remembering when she used to feed albino paws in gardens that cost more than whole palaces. His hands, a soft day like silk and adorned with rings that could buy small towns, are now dry clutches that cling to the cold body of the dead animal like a sacred relic. In the distance, tourists photograph the same palazzos, where she once reigned as a pagan goddess of beauty and excess, not knowing that they are stepping on the footprints of a woman who turned her own life into a work of art that lasted half a century and cost her soul. If you have already wondered how beauty can become a more cruel prison than any cell, how luxury can turn into a curse that chases your victims beyond death, and how a woman can literally get lost within her own artistic creation, leave her like and subscribe to any of our dives in the most fascinating and tragic lives in history. Today, we will explore every dark corner of the existence of one of the most enigmatic and devastatingly beautiful figures in 20th century Europe, a woman who turned her entire life into an endless performance, just to find that all art, however perfect and elaborate, is bound to forgetting, and that the price of artistic immortality can be the complete death of humanity behind the work. Luisa Adani was born in Milan on January 23, 1881. Such a cold winter morning that midwives feared that the child would not survive the early hours. Daughter of Alberto Adani, Count of Castiglione, a man whose huge fortune had been built on the golden foundations of cotton and silk that fed the voracious Italian industrial revolution. She came into the world already intended for a life where money would never be a concern, but where other forms of hunger would be infinitely more devastating. The 19th century was coming to an end with the slowness of melancholy symphony, and with it, aristocratic Europe was dyed desperately to cling to the last traces of a power that no longer belonged to him, like an aged woman who refuses to remove makeup at the end of a ball that ended hours ago. It was a unique time where the new money, still smelling of the sweat of factories and the tears of the workers, tried to buy what the old blood still had divine right. Instinctive refinement, mystery cultivated through generations, the seemingly magical capacity to transform everyday life into permanent theater. Villa Adani, where Luisa spent the first 17 years of her existence, was a monument to bourgeois taste raised to her most extravagant zenith. French gardens stretched by hectares, villages by Carrara, marble statues that cost individual fortunes, sources that spoiled fragrant water with imported essences from the east, air, conditioned greenhouses where rare orchids flourished in controlled atmospheres like organic jewelry. Each room of the mansion was a different thematic universe. The Turkish hall with its gold-embroidered silk pads, the English library with leather-bound volumes that no one has ever read, the conservatory where a Steinway tail piano remained eternally tuned for concerts that rarely happened. But it was precisely in this material abundance that resided the poison that would poison Luisa's future existence. The girl who would grow up to become legendary Luisa Casati was raised in the most refined luxury, but a cold, calculated luxury devoid of human warmth. Maybe you might have taught her that soulless beauty is just expensive decoration, that the most precious objects in the world cannot fill the void left by the absence of genuine connection with other human beings. At 17, Luisa already had what the social chroniclers of the time, mature men and envious women who documented each movement of high society, repeatedly described as a disturbing beauty that challenges the natural laws of harmony. Her red-haired hair cascaded on her back like liquid copper rivers, reflecting the light in ways that seemed to challenge physics, creating gold halos that made her look like a medieval saint painted by Renaissance masters. Her skin had almost supernatural translucency, as if she had never been touched by the sun or time, maintaining a porcelain pallor that contrasted dramatically with her naturally red lips, and the green eyes of an almost feline intensity that mesmerized everyone who dared to sustain her look for more than a few seconds. But perhaps it was in her gestures to reside the true fascination she exercised over everyone around her. a slowness calculated in each movement, an almost choreographic accuracy in the way it held a crystal bowl or straightened a hair, gestures that suggested not natural spontaneity, but conscious and permanent composition, as if it already understood that it was being constantly observed and judged, and that each gesture of it would be memorized and commented for years. In 1900, at the age of 19, an age considered almost late for marriage in the aristocracy of the time, Luisa married Camillo Casati Stampa, Marquis of Soncino, a 20-year-old man, whose main and perhaps only attractive quality was a huge fortune inherited from generations of ancestors who had accumulated lands and titles through strategic marriages and carefully calculated, coupled with an allied marriages, allied with a complete and almost pathological indifference to marital life, that would allow the wife all the freedom she wanted to pursue her own obsessions. From the first moment, the marriage was a commercial transaction disguised as a romance, executed with the cold efficiency of a bank operation. It offered exceptional beauty and radiant youth. It offered unquestionable aristocratic status and financial resources that seemed literally infinite. There was no love between them, not even the pretense of affection. Only mutual convenience, surrounded by white silk layers and empty religious pronouncements. Perhaps it was precisely this total absence of genuine emotional connection that planted in Luisa the first seeds of an insatiable hunger for attention, recognition, and worship that would grow over time to completely consume everything it had originally been. What young Luisa did not understand yet, in her aristocratic naivete, was that she had simply changed a golden cage for a slightly larger and more luxurious. The crucial difference was that now she had the keys in her own hands, but would soon find out that she didn't know where to go, that freedom, when she arises without clear purpose or definite direction, can become the most cruel and devastating of prisons. Palazzo San Gregorio, Venice, fall of 1910. Luisa Casati had settled in one of the most imposing and historically significant palazzas of the Great Canal, a 15th century structure that had hosted popes and emperors. But she was not content to be just another respectable resident of the Venetian aristocracy that spent the days organizing elegant dinners and the salons discussing European politics. She had decided, with the general determination of a general planning a military campaign that would be a work of living art, a creature that simultaneously challenged the laws of nature and the most rooted social conventions of her time. Their transformations have begun misleadingly. A little more than Egyptian kohl applied around the already naturally dramatic eyes, slightly bold jewelry than those dictated by contemporary Parisian fashion, dresses that bordered the theatrical without completely crossing the line of unacceptable eccentricity. But these seemingly smaller changes were just the first chords of a symphony that would become progressively more complex, more bold, and eventually more destructive. In a matter of months, their experiments evolved to something much more radical and disturbing. She began to paint her eyes with concentric black kohl circles so intense and geometrically perfect that they looked like dimensional holes in her face, portals to an alternative universe where beauty followed completely different laws. Applied white powder imported from Japan to her skin until she acquired the dead pallor effera of a Victorian porcelain doll, creating a supernatural contrast with the blood-painted lips and the eyebrows outlined in deep black. But perhaps the most memorable and disturbing element of its transformation were the false eyelashes that it had to create, especially by Parisian artisans, human hair structures and feathers that measured 6 inches long, so long and dramatic that created mobile shadows on their own face, causing their expressions to change constantly depending on light and vision angle. They were less eyelashes than miniature artistic facilities, mobile sculptures that turned each blink into a memorable visual event. Her red hair, which in youth had fallen into natural waves in the back, were now shaped in architectural forms that challenged gravity and common sense. Elaborate towers adorned with impossible, dyed ostrich feathers, exotic flowers kept alive by hidden irrigation systems, small precious sculptures that moved her head. She didn't dress in the morning. She assembled as a complex artistic installation that needed to be carefully reconstructed with each public appearance, a process that could take up to 6 hours and required the assistance of a team of specialized servants. But Luisa's true obsession was not in the physical transformation itself, but in the reaction she caused everyone around her. She studied people's faces when she entered a room like a scientist observing chemical reactions in the laboratory, mentally cataloged every expression of fascination, shock, desire, envy, or repulsion as precious data that confirmed the success of her ongoing experiment. Life had become a permanent laboratory where she was simultaneously the dedicated researcher and the constant evolution experiment, and the others, husbands, lovers, artists, aristocrats, created, were mere spectators of a show she would never get or desire interrupt. Their Palazzo San Gregorio balls have become legendary throughout Europe, not by traditional elegance or the quality of music and food, although both were impeccable, but for the calculated strangeness of every detail. She received guests dressed as a Gothic Cleopatra, surrounded by living snakes imported from Egypt that rolled into her arms like organic jewelry that breathed and moved, creating hypnotic patterns of bright scales against her skin alabastron. On other memorable occasions, it appeared to be covered only by peacock plumes and diamonds arranged in geometric patterns on the body, or dressed as a medieval widow with black veils that stretched by tens of meters and were carried by an army of uniformed servants. The exotic animals she kept in the palace were not simple pets, but full elements of her constantly evolving theatrical persona. Leopards of the snow walked freely through the halls, their diamond collars reflecting the lights of the Venice crystal chandeliers. Russian galgos, slender as living works of art, posed beside him during formal dinners. Albinos, very rare creatures she paid fortunes to acquire, created a white surreal contrast on white when they spread through the palace gardens like poultry ghosts in a feverish dream. What had begun as acceptable aristocratic eccentricity soon became uncontrollable compulsion. Luisa found that she could no longer exist without the constant spectacle, without permanent attention, without the daily confirmation that she was, in fact, the most extraordinary creature of her day. She had become a prisoner of her own artistic creation, a woman who needed to be a work of art at every agreed moment, otherwise she completely disappeared. Not physically, but existentially, losing the sole sense of identity she still understood. Between 1910 and 1914, a period that art historians would later consider the golden years of Belle Époque European, Luisa Casati turned her love life into a meticulously healed collection of cases that were less about genuine passion and more about aesthetic accumulation, as if each lover were a rare and unique jewel to add to her personal collection, a piece of living art that would contribute to the biggest existence. Household writers, revolutionary painters, decadentist poets, bored aristocrats, all gravitated around their magnetic orbit as planets captured by a sun that burned more intensely than illuminated, attracted not only by its exceptional beauty, but by the promise of participating in something truly unique in the history of European art and social life. Gabriele D'Annunzio, the Italian poet whose reputation as a seductive rivalry with her international literary fame, and whose loving scandals were as commented as her verses, she became one of her most celebrated and best documented lovers. A man of grandiose appetites and proportionally immense ego, D'Annunzio saw in Luisa not just another loving achievement, but a muse worthy of his self-proclaimed genius. He immortalized her in elaborate verses that spoke of a wisdom woman whose kisses poison and heal simultaneously, and a goddess of decay that presides over the death of an era. But even her most elaborate and poetically ambitious words could not completely capture Luisa's disturbing and disbelieving essence. What D'Annunzio interpreted as pure poetic inspiration, Luisa experienced as an urgent existential need. Being seen, being desired, being the subject of obsessive conversations and artistic creations of others, was the only way she knew of confirming her own existence, of proving herself that she occupied a unique and irreplaceable place in the universe. Her encounters were choreographed as theatrical scenes, with her always in the role of absolute protagonist, directing not only her own performance, but also orchestrating the reactions and answers of her partners. But perhaps it was with Auguste Rodin, the already elderly French sculptor master, but still obsessed with the feminine form in all his manifestations, which Luisa found his most faithful and understanding artistic mirror. Rodin, with his experienced eyes of those who had spent decades studying and reproducing the human body in bronze and marble, saw in it not only a traditional muse, but a fascinating sculptural puzzle, a body that challenged traditional anatomy laws through experimental fashion and radical makeup, a human form that constantly reinventing itself as if it were made of malleable clay. He repeatedly shaped her in her Parisian studio, trying to capture not only her physical appearance, a task already challenging, sufficiently as she changed constantly, but the restless and almost electric energy that she radiated even in times of apparent rest. Modeling sessions became intimate and intense rituals, where both explored the fluid boundaries between art and life, between artistic creation and personal self-destruction, between the desire for immortality through art, and the deep fear that real life was insufficient compared to the idealized version. What few of the observers of the time realized, and that perhaps not even he herself completely understood, was that Luisa did not really love these men in the conventional sense of the word. She consumed them, absorbed them, turned them into extensions of their own artistic personality. Each relationship was an elaborate performance within an even greater performance, each intimate meeting a carefully orchestrated opportunity to be seen under a new revealing light, to confirm and expand its power to fascinate and disturb simultaneously. She collected not only lovers, but their reactions, the specific words they used to describe her, the way she remained recorded in her memories much after she abandoned them to pursue new goals. Love letters became documents of her own historical significance. Poems dedicated to her were certified of her cultural importance. Portraits painted by artists were tangible evidence that she had transcended the common reality to become mythological. It was a peculiar and sophisticated form of emotional vampirism. It did not drain literal blood from its arranged victims, but concentrated attention, genuine admiration, the ability to see transcendent beauty where others would see only elaborated device. And like every true vampire, she was condemned to hunger that could never be completely satiated, because each achievement only exponentially intensified the need for the next. Every confirmation of her power only revealed the deepest void she was trying to fill through these external validations. 1914 marked not only the beginning of World War I, would completely redesign the political and social map of Europe, but also the beginning of the slow but inexorable dissolution of the carefully constructed world that Luisa had created for themselves over more than a decade of experimentation and extravagance. The aristocratic Europe that had served as a perfect stage for its elaborate performances was being literally destroyed by modern artillery and the irreversible social change that war accelerated, as a play being interrupted by a fire that consumes the theater itself. The money she spent as if she were an inexhaustible source, conservative estimates based on partially preserved financial records, suggest that he fell off the equivalent of over 100 million current dollars at parties, clothing, artistic whims, and exotic animals, was beginning to show worrying signs of exhaustion. Family's textile factories, a primary source of fortuna Casati, faced constant interruptions due to war, while investments in Austro-Hungarian government titles became increasingly questionable as the empire was disintegrated. But Luisa, in her self-created fantasy bubble, couldn't or wanted to recognize the obvious signs of change. In fact, the war had made its theatricality even more psychologically necessary, as if it could, through the pure strength of its visual extravagance and its refusal to accept the new reality, keep a world that was dying around it alive. His parties had become more elaborate and surreal, his most extreme and technically impossible costumes, his most dramatic and time-consuming makeup to apply. It was during this time that she hired the best and most innovative photographers of the time, Man Ray, Castle Beaton, Baron Adolf de Meyer, Adolfo Fardari, not just to document her constant appearance evolving, but to create a comprehensive visual mythology that she was arising, that she would survive herself, a collection of images that would serve as eternal evidence that she had existed and was extraordinary. The photographs of this period, when examined today in the files of museums and private collections, reveal a woman in fast and progressively more radical transformation. In the 1915 portraits, it is still possible to identify traces of the natural beauty it had in your youth, but already covered by increasingly thick layers of calculated device. His poses have become more theatrical, his most penetrating and disturbing looks, his relationship with the most consciously seductive and at the same time challenging camera. In 1918, when the war ended, leaving Europe unrecognizably altered, it had become almost completely unrecognizable, compared to the young aristocrat who had married 18 years earlier. It was an elaborate creature, made of makeup layers applied as paint on a canvas, jewelry arranged as architectural elements, manipulated fabrics to create forms that challenged human anatomy. The human body seemed to serve only as a necessary mannequin to support visual fantasy, a structural support for a daily work of art. What is most impressive when examining these historical images is not just the obvious visual extravagance, but the tangible and devastating loneliness they convey. Even when surrounded by dozens of people at her legendary parties, when posing alongside famous lovers, when interacting with her exotic animals, Luisa seems to exist in complete isolation, as if inhabited a parallel dimension where only she really existed, where all others were just extras in a drama that only she understood. His eyes, covered by progressively thicker layers of kohl and framed by false eyelashes that reached architectural dimensions, gradually lost the ability to reveal genuine emotions or spontaneous thoughts. They were just decorative elements in a larger visual composition, windows that had been painted black inside so that no one could see what really happened inside. It was as if she had made a factual pact with her own image, in exchange for becoming visually unforgettable, creating a personal brand that would transcend decades and influence future generations of artists and designers. She had consciously resigned from the possibility of being known as real human being. Each photography represented one more step towards artistic immortality and, at the same time, a step further away from the possibility of genuine human connection. Palazzo Venier dei Leoni, Venice, spring of 1920. Luisa had moved to an even more grand and historically significant palace, an 18th century structure that had remained incomplete for centuries. Only the first floor had been built, creating a low but extraordinarily broad base that extended as a marble platform over the dark waters of the Great Channel. But his relationship with the physical space had become deeply pathological and disturbing to all who watched it closely. She decorated environments as elaborate theatrical scenarios, investing fortunes in old Persian rugs, 17th century French furniture, Murano crystal chandeliers who weighed tons and required special support structures. Each room was transformed into a complete thematic universe. an oriental hall with royal gold embroidered pillows, a winter garden with tropical plants kept alive by deer warming systems, a Gothic library with human leather-bound books that she had medieval monasteries in dissolution. But after completing these artistic facilities that cost individual fortunes, it simply abandoned them, allowing them to rot and deteriorate as they moved to another room and began a new decorative obsession. It was a compulsive and self-destructive pattern. Designed creation followed by full abandonment, intense emotional and financial investment followed by total indifference. The palace gradually became a haunted maze of abandoned room salons where the most expensive flowers in Europe withering slowly in crystal vessels that cost more than whole houses, rooms where hand-embroidered dresses by Parisian artisans were left on the floor of marble like discarded shells, libraries where rare books and unique manuscripts accumulated dust and dust and dust. I lost interest in the specific character I had created for that particular space. She did not inhabit the palace in the traditional sense. She performed him, used it as a series of drama stages that only she understood. And when a performance came to an end, when she got tired of a particular version of herself, when an obsession lost the initial glow, she simply closed the door of that room and began another creation elsewhere, leaving behind a growing collection of abandoned scenarios. The servants, initially a team of more than 30 people, including specialized gardeners, French cooks, personal seamstresses, and exotic animal keepers, whispered with each other about the increasingly erratic behavior of their employer. They spoke low on whole rooms that she had to decorate with thousands of white roses imported from Bulgaria, just to never get into them after the installation was complete. On elaborate dinners and very expensive prepared for 50 guests who never appeared, because she had changed her mind about which version of herself wanted to present that specific night. About exotic animals, Burmanian snakes, South American monkeys, tropical birds, that died of negligence and loneliness while it was obsessively focused on the acquisition of even rarer and more impractical. The palace had become a perfect and cruel metaphor for its inner life, grand and impressive on the surface, but in constant decomposition underneath, like a magnificently make-up corpse. Each abandoned room represented a version of itself that it had experienced intensely and then discarded as inappropriate. Each forgotten object was an obsession that had lost the power to satisfy the growing emptiness it felt. She didn't collect things to get pleasure with them, to build a cozy home, or to create lasting memories. It accumulated objects, environments, and even people to fill an existential hole that grew proportionally to the amount of things it acquired, such as a perverse mathematical equation, where it was most always resulting in less real satisfaction. Irony was devastatingly cruel. A woman who had devoted her entire adult life to being seen, being the center of attention in any environment where she appeared, lived in a palace where most spaces remained empty of witnesses to her increasingly elaborate and desperate creations. She was becoming an artist without audience, an actress representing for walls who had stopped reflecting her image for years, an obsessed creator producing works that no one else cared to see. The New York Stock Exchange crash has sent economic shockwaves that reached even the most established and seemingly protected fortunes in aristocratic Europe. But it was in 1930 that Luisa discovered, with the brutal shock of someone who wakes up from a dream of decades, that the money she had treated as a literally infinite source had in fact very concrete and inflexible limits. For the first time in almost 5 decades of existence, she faced the possibility not only of material poverty, a concept that her aristocratic mind could barely process, but of social invisibility, the most terrifying perspective for someone who had built her entire identity about being seen, admired, and commented. The first to disappear were the jewelry, those precious objects that had functioned as a second shining skin for decades, pieces that had been created especially for her by the best jewelers of Paris, London, and New York, necklaces that looked like liquid diamond and emerald waterfalls, tiaras that turned their head into a pure light crown, bracelets that climbed by the arms like jammed platinum serpents, were vended as one by one for discreet pawn houses that attended the decline aristocracy, each transaction a short death she faced with the desperate dignity of a dethroned queen. Each sale was like surgically a piece of its own identity, because these jewelry were not simply expensive ornaments or financial investments. They were essential components of her visual persona, elements without which she could no longer recognize herself in the mirror. The black pearl necklace that had worn on Man Ray's famous portrait, the diamond earrings that were taking her head in her most memorable apparitions, the sized emerald ring that had belonged to a Russian empress. Each piece carried memories of social triumphs, when it had been absolutely magnificent and undeniable. Exotic animals were the next elements of their lives to be sacrificed on the altar of financial need. The leopards, who had walked by their side at legendary Venetian balls, creating unforgettable visual contrasts between tamed savagery and extreme human elegance. The albino paws that had served as focus points in their most photographed artistic facilities. Rare creatures whose white purity created chromatic harmonies perfect with their own artificial pallor. The Russian galers who had posed gracefully by their side in hundreds of portraits, their slender bodies echoing their own body lines carved by corset and studied postures. Each match was a small emotional death, because these animals were not only pets in the conventional sense, but vivid extensions of their theatrical personality, elements without which it could no longer conceive of their own existence. They had been carefully selected, not by natural affection, but because of their aesthetic value, because of their ability to contribute to the larger visual composition that was their entire life. Finally, the most devastating time has come, the forced sale of the palaces that had served as scenarios for some of the most memorable performances of the 20th century. Palazzo San Gregorio, where she had created her first truly revolutionary shows, where she had received the most important artists and writers of her day, where she had first transformed her life into pure art, was sold by a fraction of her real value to an American industrialist that would turn him into a luxury hotel, erasing decades of personal memories and transformations. Palazzo Venier de Leoni, with his abandoned rooms and his past obsessions ghosts, followed the same cruel path. Each sale forced her to confront a truth that she had avoided for decades, without the elaborate scenarios that had framed her performances, without the expensive costumes who had defined their appearances, without the rare objects that had served as extensions of her personality, who she really was. What was your essential identity, stripped of all the devices that had accumulated over the half a century of obsessive self-creation? The answer was terrifying in her devastating simplicity. She didn't know. It had spent so much time being a living work of art, a conscious and elaborate creation that had completely forgotten, or perhaps never learned, as simply a human being. Her identity was so intertwined with material objects, physical spaces, and visual appearances that without them she was beginning to feel like a ghost of herself, a shadow that gradually lost substance and definition. London, winter of 1935. Luisa had voluntarily exiled in a small apartment in Belgravia, a space that represented a dizzying and humiliating fall in relation to the Venetian palaces that had been his home for decades, but that she still desperately tried to turn into a scenario worthy of her diminished fantasies. With dramatically limited resources for the first time in her adult life, she became an artist of forced improvisation, a creator forced to make magic with the few elements she still had or could get with the little money left. She painted her own furniture with cheap gold ink purchased from local tool stores, trying to recreate the shine of the precious objects she had lost. It covered the walls with fabrics found in second, hand flea markets and bazaars, creating elaborate drapes that mimicked the decorations of their lost palaces. He created desperately elaborated facilities, using wildflowers secretly harvested in public parks at dawn, when no one could see her by performing this task that was once unthinkable for a marquise. It was like watching a great core director internationally acclaimed trying to make a Hollywood epic with a budget of independent film. Ambition remained grand, and the artistic vision remained complex, but the resources were devastatingly, crudely limited. Each creation simultaneously revealed its genius to the visual transformation and the tragic depth of its social and financial fall. What most impressed and disturbed the few visitors still looking for her, old friends moved by morbid curiosity, journalists interested in documenting her decay, occasional admirers of her golden age, was her apparent psychological disability of adapting her lifestyle to new economic circumstances. She kept making up every morning with the same dramatic intensity as usual, a ritual that now lasted even longer because she needed to get the same visual effects with infinitely inferior cosmetics and makeshift tools. She continued to dress like a royal ball at any time, combining cheap garments with the few precious accessories she had been able to hide from creditors, creating visual compositions that were simultaneously magnificent and deeply melancholic. He continued planning and executing elaborate parties for guests who no longer came, preparing tables decorated with the same obsessive attention to the details, as if he sincerely believed that, keeping all the rituals of extravagance, he could magically invoke back the material and social abundance he had lost. It was a fascinating and devastating example of psychological denial brought to its most extreme consequences. She seemed genuinely unable to accept that her golden age was over, that the world had changed, that she was no longer the central figure of a social fascination that had been for so many years. Each gesture kept the same theatrical quantity as usual. Each public appearance was choreographed with the same obsessive accuracy, as if she were playing the role of Luisa Casati for an audience that had stopped paying attention. But perhaps the most tragic and symbolically powerful aspect of this time of his life was his new relationship with the mirrors. It had covered almost all reflective surfaces of the small apartment with dark fabrics, or turned the mirrors to the wall, becoming unable to confront the physical reality of a 54-year-old woman whose face showed the devastating and irreversible signs of decades of heavy makeup, experimental surgeries performed by charlatans, and the psychological stress of an entire existence of an impossible image. The device that had once been its trademark and its most powerful weapon of seduction now revealed, with increasing cruelty, the inexorable deterioration that happened under the layers of paint and dust. His hands shake as he applied the coal around his eyes, creating irregular lines that accentuated wrinkles instead of hiding them. His skin, subjected to decades of chemicals and aggressive treatments, had acquired an artificial texture and a little natural color that no amount of makeup could more correctly correct. She was becoming an involuntary caricature of herself, an impoverished and desperate version of the woman who had been the inspiring muse of an entire generation of artists, writers, and photographers. But he could not stop the process of daily self-creation, because he would mean admitting that his whole life had just been a long and astronomically expensive spectacle that no one else wanted to watch, that his entire identity had been built on foundations that turned out to be illusory. Paris, autumn 1940. World War II had begun with all its modern brutality, and Luisa found himself trapped in a city occupied by the Germans, where luxury and extravagance were not only economically impracticable, but potentially dangerous to anyone who caught unnecessary attention about herself. For the first time in almost 60 years of existence, she was forced by history and the circumstances to mingle with the anonymous crowds, to be just another person among millions, to experience the total anonymity that had always been her biggest fear and her deepest existential anguish. She walked the streets of Paris wearing a simple and worn black coat, the last authentic elegance trace she had managed to keep through all sales and financial losses, but still religiously applied her dramatic makeup every morning with her increasingly trembling hands of a woman of almost 60 years that was beginning to show the first signs of neurological decline. The visual contrast was simultaneously disturbing and moving, a face painted as an elaborate theatrical mask mounted on a body that had lost all physical greatness, a woman who insisted, obsessive, not to be a visual spectacle in a world that had completely stopped watching and caring. The young Parisians, those who had not fled the city or were deported to work fields, looked at it with a complex mix of curiosity, pen, and occasional cruel fun, completely unable to imagine that they were seeing the last walking remnants of an entire time of European cultural history. For them, she was simply another eccentric old man who made up excessively and dressed strangely. They could not conceive that this diminished woman had once dictated fashion trends in all European capitals, that her image had inspired some of the greatest visual artists of the 20th century, which she had literally transformed her own existence into a work of living art that influenced an entire generation of creators. It was during this time of war and universal deprivation that she developed one of the most disturbing habits and symbolically carried from her long life of eccentricities. She began carrying small dead objects that found on the streets, birds that had fallen from urban trees, completely withered flowers she collected from abandoned gardens, sometimes small rodents or insects she discovered in dark corners of the city besieged. She held these objects of beauty destroyed with the same reverent tenderness that she had once reserved for her most precious and rare jewels, as if in these examples of natural death, she recognized something deeply familiar about her own existential condition. It was a simultaneously macabre and touching ritual. A woman who had devoted 6 decades of life to the creation and maintenance of artificial beauty, now collecting and preserving examples of organic beauty that had been naturally lost and abandoned. The war had created a surreal world where everyone wore masks of some kind. Gas masks against chemical attacks, emotional indifference masks to psychologically survive daily horrors, collaboration masks, or resistance depending on political circumstances. Ironically, this made Luisa's perpetual makeup mask less conspicuous and socially more acceptable than it had been in decades. She had finally found a historical context where her constant theatrical appearance made some kind of tragic meaning, but it was too late for this coincidence to bring him any real comfort or personal satisfaction. And on darker nights, when Allied bombings illuminated the Parisian sky with terrible beauty, she sat by the window of her small rented room, still dressed in her elaborate clothes even if no one went to see her, still makeup even if she had not left home for days, talking in whispers with the little dead animals they collected, as if the only companions who still understood their particular language. Venice, spring of 1949. Luisa had finally returned to the city that saw her from becoming a young conventional aristocrat into a living myth, but now as a refugee in her own personal history, a melancholy tourist visiting the scenarios of her own lost grandeur. She had managed to rent a small, modest apartment near the old Palazzo San Gregorio, where she could see, through the narrow window that gave to the great channel, the magnificent palace that once had been her absolute kingdom, the scene of her most memorable and influential artistic creations. At 68, she had become a walking and ghostly shadow of her own legend, an appearance that disturbed local Venetians not by their greatness, but for their persistent refusal to accept that the show had ended decades ago. His skin, subjected to over half a century of heavy makeup, experimental treatments performed by charlatan doctors, and the constant psychological stress of an entire existence dedicated to maintaining an impossible image, had acquired an almost artificial texture, as ancient porcelain that was broken and poorly repaired multiple times. Her hair, once Rita's like liquid fire and a source of female envy throughout Europe, were now sparse and brittle gray strands hidden under colorful turbans that she sewed with cheap fabrics found in local markets, trying to recreate features limited to the visual magnificence she had once had naturally. His eyes, still religiously painted every morning with black coal applied with trembling hands, had completely lost the hypnotic feline shine that once bewitched an entire generation of powerful men. But she kept fulfilling her daily ritual out to the streets, walking slowly and with growing difficulty with the narrow channels and arched bridges, that hall of memory since his youth, always carrying a small dead animal that he had found during his walks, a cat that had died of old age or illness, a bird that had fallen from a tree, sometimes just a rat or other small urban rodent. She packed these lifeless creatures with the extreme delicacy of a mother lining a sick child, talking to them in intimate and loving whispers that occasional passers-by could not understand but transmitted a genuine tenderness that perhaps the most authentic emotion she had publicly demonstrated in decades. It was as if, in these creatures that had lost the battle against time and mortality, she finally found companions who understood her own existential situation. Older Venetians, those who still vaguely remembered from glorious days when Marchesa Casati was a legendary figure who turned the city into her personal stage, still recognized her occasionally and whispered her name when she passed. But these identifications were rare and usually accompanied more than admiration. For younger generations, for tourists who began to rediscover Venice in the post-war, she was just an old harmless eccentric that dressed strangely and kept intimate conversations with dead animals. The woman who had once literally stopped Treafago in London when she appeared in public, who had caused curiosity riots in Paris, who had been obsessively photographed by the best photographers in the world, now walking through the streets of Venice without causing a curious occasional look, a brief disturbance in the daily routine of the local inhabitants who soon returned to their personal concerns. On January 1st, 1957, Luisa Casati died alone in her small Venetian apartment during one of the most intense cold waves the city had experienced in decades. She was found 3 days later by her landlady, who had gone to see why she didn't hear any movement from the apartment. She was sitting on her favorite armchair, still wearing one of her most elaborate dresses, still completely made up, though she didn't receive visits for weeks, surrounded not by admirers or old lovers, but by carefully organized piles from old magazines where her image still appeared occasionally by yellow, part photographs that no one else remembered, by cheap objects that she had tried to transform into the pure strength of her imagination. And will. Luisa Casati's death has practically unnoticed by the international press of the time. The newspapers and magazines that once dedicated whole pages to their most spectacular public appearances, which sent photographers especially to document their innovative costumes, which analyzed every detail of their visual creations as if they were cultural events of historical importance, now limited to small standard nicological notes that simply described it as eccentric Italian aristocrat of early 20th century artists. As if a lifetime of conscious and revolutionary self-creation, 6 decades of artistic experimentation with one's own body and identity, an existence that had profoundly influenced fashion, photography, performance art, and modern celebrity concept, could be adequately summarized in some standard journalistic text lines in obituaries that could not even capture a fraction of the complexity and originality of their contribution to culture 20th century visual. The funeral was deliberately simple, almost anonymous, a devastatingly cruel irony for someone who had turned every conscious moment of his adult life into an elaborate and carefully choreographed spectacle. The ceremony was held in a small Venetian church frequented mainly by local residents, without pomp or drama that had characterized all their public appearances for decades. Few attended religious service, and those who came were mainly curious places who had known only the strange old lady of recent years, not the legendary Luisa Casati, who had inspired passionate sonnets, memorable sculptures, and paintings that still hang in important museums. Her material possessions, when they were carefully inventoried after their death, brutally revealed the devastating extension of their social and financial fall. Some fake, inferior jewelry, carefully cautious clothing that still tried to maintain an illusory air of aristocratic elegance, cheap makeup piles that it had worn in recent years to maintain visual illusion of grandeur, dozens of the golden time that it has contemplated as it relics of a past that looked like the other person. But perhaps the most touching and symbolically significant find was a collection of small mirrors of different sizes and shapes, all carefully covered with dark fabrics or wall facing the wall. The discovery revealed that she had spent the last 15 years of her life systematically avoiding her own reflection, becoming psychologically unable to confront what had become after decades of artificial transformation. The woman who had once looked in the mirror with narcissistic pride, who had spent daily hours studying every angle of her face to optimize the visual impact, which had obsessively photographed to document each phase of her aesthetic evolution, had ended her life in absolute terror of her own image. hiding from herself as if her own ghost. The few valuables were discreetly sold to cover the final debts. The clothes were donated to local charity organizations, where they were probably used by people who had no idea of their historical provenance. Photographs were stored in museum files, where they are rarely consulted by specialized researchers. In a matter of a few months, it was as if Luisa Casati had never really existed, as if all that elaborate construction of herself had just been a collective and fleeting dream that an entire generation had shared briefly and then completely forgotten. But perhaps this was, ironically, the posthumous revenge for a woman who had devoted her conscious existence to challenging time through art and self-creation, by disappearing so completely from public awareness when becoming a total absence rather than a diminished presence. She paradoxically became more fascinating for future generations, more truly unforgettable than she had ever managed to be during her life. Constant. Today, more than 65 years after his lonely death in that cold Venetian apartment, Luisa Casati lives a second strange and fascinating life in contemporary art galleries, in the pages of specialized books on fashion and artistic avant-garde, academic studies on performance art and conscious self-presentation. His photographs, especially those taken by Man Ray, Cecil Beaton, and Baron Adolf of Meyer, are studied and analyzed as pioneering examples of concepts that would only be formally articulated decades after their death: the deconstruction of gender identity, performance as a form of legitimate art, the deliberate transformation of the human body into a work of living art. Haute couture contemporary designers regularly cite their radical aesthetics as a source of direct inspiration for entire collections. Art critics write academic essays on their revolutionary contribution to the modern celebrity concept and self-promotion. Fashion historians consistently include it among the most important figures they defined and anticipated the visual trends of the 20th century. Its influence can be seen in everything, from advertising campaigns, from luxury brands to musicians, from contemporary pop artists who consciously echo their dramatic aesthetics. But this posthumous resurrection, this late canonization in the pantheon of modern art, reveals a deeply bitter and disturbing truth about our cultural relationship with beauty, luxury, self, invention, and the psychological price of artistic success. We celebrate Luisa Casati today precisely because she has been dead for decades, because we no longer need to confront the real and problematic woman behind the work of art, because we can admire and analyze visual creation without having to deal emotionally with the creator and their basic human needs. She became exactly what she always wanted to be since her aristocratic youth: a perfect, untouchable, eternal image, free from the limitations of physical reality and the demands of human connection. But to achieve this artistic immortality she wished so much, she had to gradually renounce, but completely, to humanity that existed behind the work, sacrificing not only her fortune and her natural beauty, but also her ability to establish genuine relationships with other human beings. Its history acts as a disturbing mirror where we can still see many of our most problematic contemporary obsessions. The culture of the image that dominates social networks, the search desperate for validation through physical appearance, the growing confusion between being and seems that it defines so much of our digital existence, the transformation of personal life into constant performance for invisible audiences. At a time when self-image became an art form accessible to anyone with a smartphone and an Instagram account, Luisa Casati comes up as a tragic prophet that he anticipated with scary precision the psychological dangers of an entirely performative life. It teaches us, through its extreme and devastating example, that it is technically possible to become a work of living art, but that works of art, as beautiful, innovative, or influential, do not breathe emotionally, do not feel authentic connections, do not establish genuine bonds with other human beings. They exist to be contemplated and admired at a distance, not to be loved or really known, to be remembered as images and concepts, not to be understood as people with normal human needs, fears, and desires. In the end, Luisa Casati got something that very few people in history can. She has truly become unforgettable, a figure that continues to fascinate and inspire over half a century after her death. But the price he paid was completely forgetting herself during the process, losing not only her material fortune and her physical beauty, but also, and perhaps more tragically, the ability to distinguish between the woman she really was and the elaborate image she had created for public consumption. Perhaps this is the most cruel and philosophically devastating irony of all its existence. She dedicated every conscious moment of her adult life to being seen, observed, photographed, commented, and remembered, but no one, not even herself in her final moments of Venetian loneliness, has never really managed to see her as the vulnerable and needy human being of love that existed behind all the layers, jewelry performance. It became invisible through excess visibility, unknown through excess fame, alone through excessive public attention. Your life leaves us with a disturbing question that echoes today in our obsessed culture with image. Is it worth becoming a work of art if the price is ceasing to be human? Luisa Casati answered this question with her own existence, and her answer continues to haunt us decades after her silent death in that Venetian winter, when she finally stopped makeup to a world she had stopped looking.